A rifleman is lying in elephant grass somewhere south of Pleiku, sometime in 1968, and he has just been hit through the thigh by an AK round that clipped the femoral artery on its way through. He knows exactly how much time that gives him. He has heard the same brief a dozen times in country. Bleed out from a hit like this in a handful of minutes if nobody stops it. His squad medic is already on him, packing the wound, screaming the casualty report into a hand mic. Somewhere, behind that voice, a different voice is already answering. A pilot, call sign Dustoff, banking a Huey toward the coordinates before the medic has even finished the sentence. The wounded man does not know the pilot's name. He does not know if the landing zone up ahead is secure or hot. He only knows that, in the next few minutes, either the helicopter reaches him or it does not, and that single fact will decide more about his survival than anything a surgeon does afterward. Today, we're examining the complete Medevac reality of the Vietnam War Grunt. The call sign that became a verb. The unofficial motto that governed how far unarmed pilots were willing to fly into enemy fire. The color-coded smoke that turned a jungle clearing into a targetable point from the sky. The triage system that decided who got lifted first when only one aircraft was on station. The hoist extractions performed straight through triple canopy when no clearing existed at all. The weather that grounded the entire system and left wounded men waiting on the ground, regardless of how badly they were bleeding. And the statistic that made Vietnam different from every American war that came before it. A survival rate for wounded soldiers that no earlier generation of combat medicine had ever achieved. The word Dustoff did not begin as Army slang. It began as a radio call sign, assigned in 1962 to the Medical Evacuation Detachment commanded by an officer named Major Charles Kelly, and within a few years of continuous use in the field, it had stopped being a call sign and become the name of the mission itself. Grunts did not say they were calling for a Medevac helicopter. They called for a Dustoff. The distinction mattered because it was Kelly himself who set the standard that every pilot who flew the mission after him inherited, whether he wanted to or not. Kelly was killed in 1964 flying into a landing zone that ground. Commanders had warned him was under fire, refusing to abort the approach, and his last transmission before the crash became the phrase every Dustoff pilot who followed him would be measured against. When I have your wounded, not if, when. The unofficial motto that grew out of that legacy circulated through every unit that ever called for evacuation, and it was blunt enough that soldiers who heard it once never forgot it. No guts, no Dustoff. It was not a slogan the Army printed on a poster. It was an understanding, passed soldier to soldier, that the men flying unarmed helicopters into contact zones to pull out the wounded were operating under an entirely different risk calculation than every other aircraft in the war. That risk calculation deserves specific accounting because it explains why the mission carried the reputation it did. Dustoff helicopters were Hueys modified for litters instead of door guns, marked in some units with the red cross that international law was supposed to render a protected symbol, and flying into the same landing zones that infantry had just fought their way into or were still fighting to hold. The Geneva Convention markings that were meant to keep medical aircraft safe from deliberate targeting meant nothing to an enemy force that could not always distinguish a marked helicopter from any other Huey in the low light of a jungle canopy. And in many documented cases, the markings meant nothing, because the enemy targeted the aircraft anyway. understanding that grounding a unit's medevac support was itself a tactical objective. A hot landing zone, meaning a landing zone still receiving enemy fire, was the single most dangerous environment a helicopter pilot in Vietnam ever flew into voluntarily, and Dustoff pilots flew into them by mission requirement rather than as an occasional hazard of other duties. Attack helicopter crews could decline a landing zone assessed as too hot and reroute to support elsewhere. Dustoff pilots, by the standard Kelly had set, and that had become institutional practice across most crews, generally did not decline. The wounded man on the ground was the mission. The unofficial calculation was that his survival outweighed the pilot's own. These videos take real research and effort to get right, and it takes you 2 seconds to like this video and subscribe. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Getting a Dustoff aircraft to the correct patch of jungle required a marking system that could be recognized from several hundred feet in the air, through canopy, at speed, often under fire, and the solution the Army settled on was colored smoke. A ground unit calling for evacuation would pop a smoke grenade near the landing zone, and the pilot, seeing the color rising through the trees, would confirm it over the radio before committing to the approach. This confirmation step was not procedural formality. It was a direct countermeasure against a specific enemy tactic. Enemy forces that intercepted American radio traffic, or that had simply learned the pattern of Dustoff operations, would sometimes pop their own smoke near a friendly unit's actual position, hoping to lure a Medevac helicopter into a prepared ambush. The countermeasure was straightforward. The pilot would ask the ground unit to identify the color of the smoke rather than stating it himself. If the ground unit's answer did not match what the pilot was actually seeing, the aircraft broke off the approach immediately because a mismatch meant somebody other than the friendly unit had set off smoke nearby, and that somebody was very likely waiting with a weapon trained on the landing zone. When more than one wounded man needed lifting and only one aircraft was on station, the decision of who went first was governed by a triage classification system that every field medic and every Dustoff crew understood by the same 3 categories. Urgent meant a casualty who would likely die without evacuation within roughly 2 hours. Wounds like the femoral hit in the opening of this file, chest wounds, uncontrolled bleeding. Priority meant a casualty who needed evacuation within several hours but was not in immediate danger of dying on the ground. Routine meant a casualty, often a man with a wound serious enough to end his combat tour but not serious enough to threaten his life in the short term, who could wait for a later lift or a less urgent aircraft. The medic on the ground made this call, radioed it in alongside the casualty count, and the pilot planned the extraction sequence around it. In a mass casualty situation, an ambush that produced multiple wounded simultaneously, this triage call, under fire, made by a young medic often barely out of his teens, decided in real time which of his own squad mates got lifted onto the first aircraft and which had to wait for the second or the third while still under fire on the ground. Not every wounded man went out of a clearing. The jungle that Vietnam's terrain was built from did not reliably provide a landing zone anywhere near where soldiers actually got hit, and triple canopy forest in the Central Highlands or along the border regions could run continuously for miles without a natural opening large enough to set a Huey down. For casualties in this kind of terrain, the Dustoff mission required a jungle penetrator, a weighted seat lowered on a cable from a hovering helicopter straight through the canopy to the ground below, sometimes descending 80 or 100 feet through branches and vines before reaching the wounded man waiting underneath. The wounded soldier, or the medic assisting him, would strap him into the penetrator, and the crew would winch him back up through the same gap in the foliage the seat had descended through, the helicopter holding a stationary hover directly above a target it often could not see once the cable disappeared beneath the canopy. This was among the most exposed and technically demanding maneuvers Dustoff crews performed, because a hovering helicopter is a stationary helicopter, and a stationary helicopter under fire has no ability to maneuver away from incoming rounds, while the hoist operation is underway. The entire system had one vulnerability that no amount of pilot courage could overcome, and that was weather. Vietnam's monsoon seasons brought cloud ceilings low enough and visibility poor enough that helicopters simply could not fly the terrain safely, and a wounded man whose survival depended on rapid evacuation could find himself wading through hours of grounded aircraft while the ceiling refused to lift. Ground units in contact during heavy monsoon weather sometimes had no dust-off option at all until conditions improved, and units have documented carrying their own wounded on litters. For extended movements toward the nearest position an aircraft could safely reach once weather allowed it. The same was true at night in some units and in some periods of the war, though as the conflict progressed, Dustoff crews increasingly flew night missions using flares and, later in the war, early night vision equipment, extending the window, during which evacuation was possible but never fully closing the gap that weather and darkness created. What made all of this matter, beyond the individual acts of courage involved in flying it, was the outcome it produced. The concept driving the entire system was what medical personnel called the golden hour, the window of roughly 60 minutes following a serious wound, during which rapid treatment dramatically improved survival odds, and Vietnam was the first American war in which helicopter evacuation made that window achievable on a wide scale for wounded infantrymen operating far from any fixed medical facility. The statistic that resulted from this system, drawn from military medical records comparing the conflict to earlier wars, showed a died-of wounds rate significantly lower than either Korea or the Second World War, a direct outcome of average evacuation times measured in minutes rather than hours. A wounded soldier in Vietnam who reached a helicopter alive had a meaningfully better chance of surviving his wound than a wounded soldier in any earlier American conflict, and that outcome existed because of a chain that ran from a medic's triage, call under fire, through a pilot's decision to commit to a hot landing zone, through a hoist crew holding a stationary hover above canopy they could not see through, to a surgical team already prepped and waiting at a field hospital by the time the aircraft touched down. None of it felt like a statistic to the men who depended on it. It felt like the sound of rotor blades getting louder over gunfire, or it felt like the silence when the ceiling was too low and the aircraft that was supposed to be inbound simply was not coming. Grunts, who served in units with reliable dust-off support, have described a specific and constant psychological effect, an underlying confidence that carried them through firefights precisely because they knew that if they went down, someone would come for them, an assurance that soldiers in earlier wars, waiting hours or days for evacuation through conventional ground transport, did not carry into combat in the same way. That assurance was purchased by pilots and crews who flew missions with a fatality rate among the highest of any aviation role in the war, into landing zones that infantry themselves were still fighting to hold, on the understanding, inherited, from a man who never lived to see how far the standard he set would carry, that when I have you're wounded was not a conditional statement. If you served in Vietnam and remember a Dustoff coming in for you, or for someone in your unit, the comments are open and your account belongs to the historical record. Tell us what unit you were with, what the landing zone looked like, and whether the aircraft that came for you carried the markings or not. Understanding Vietnam's Medevac system means understanding how a war that inflicted casualties at every level of brutality also built. In the middle of that brutality, one of the fastest and most effective systems for getting wounded men out alive that any army had ever fielded, and what it cost the pilots and crews who made that system work. Share this to preserve accurate documentation of what Vietnam evacuation actually looked like on the ground. The sources are in the description. If you made it this far, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. The distance between a wounded man in the grass and a surgical table hundreds of miles away was closed, again and again, by men flying unarmed helicopters into fire. They had every reason to avoid and did not. If you or someone you know fought in the war, let us know in the comments and tell us where you're watching from.